Hi there, everyone. Welcome to our standing panel event. We're going to wait another minute or so. We just wanted to let you in, make sure that your sound is working and we're seeing people continue to log in and just give us another 45 seconds or so, and then we will begin. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. This is a kind of an interesting week. Today is Wednesday, and for many, it feels like Tuesday. For some, it's still a long weekend. It's not the greatest time, but as you've been seeing in all the publications from NAPA, this is a very busy week. We're not the only ones that are having an event. So I'm seeing tremendous activity coming out of NAPA, and it's a very exciting place to be part of these days. I'm Alan Shark, and I am the co-chair of the Standing Panel on Technology Leadership. And I co-chair this with Teresa Pardo, who's the Associate Vice President for Research at the University of Albany, Special Assistant to the University President, and Professor, someone I've known over the many, many years. Today, we're going to talk about cyber. And as you know, throughout the year, we've kind of dealt with artificial intelligence, all things related. And the last time we met, we had a wonderful conversation about data, and not just data in terms of classification and how it feeds AI, but the disappearing amount of data from our federal websites. So we really have had an enormously important discussion, and we believe that will continue. And we're right now trying to plan some events between now and the NAPA annual meeting. And I hope you will be able to join us for that in early November. So with that, let's set the stage here. We're going to talk today about state and local cybersecurity and digital risks, which is the title. Talk about strategies for success in the current policy environment. And as we know, nothing is normal anymore. So we're all dealing with that, regardless of your political persuasion. I'm going to serve as moderator, but I would be negligent if I didn't acknowledge one of our panelists, Bobbie Stempfley, who is a NAPA fellow and really put together this panel. So she deserves an awful lot of credit. So thank you, Bobbie, for reaching out and bringing together such a great group. But I thought rather than have you as a moderator, you have so much to share that you should be a participant as well and feel totally free to share your thoughts. So that's the reasoning behind that. So a big thank you. For those of you who don't know Bobbie, she serves as a vice president and business unit security officer at Dell Technologies, where she drives security and resilience efforts in the product business units. She has served in executive leadership roles at DHS, Department of Defense, where she has led efforts to engage with critical infrastructure and the federal government to reduce cyber risks and prepare and respond to cyber events, especially as the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communications. Tracy Doaks is president and CEO of MCNC, the technology nonprofit focused on delivering high-performance internet and networking, cloud services, cybersecurity, and other essential technologies for communities throughout the state of North Carolina. Prior to joining MCNC, Tracy was the state chief information officer and secretary for the North Carolina Department of Information Technology, where she led the agency responsible for all IT procurement, state cybersecurity, operational services, and the like. And that's when I first met Tracy in person at one of the events that we both attended. Jeff Greene is a distinguished fellow at the Aspen Institute. He serves as an executive assistant director for cybersecurity at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, better known as CISA, and the chief of cyber response and policy on the National Security Council, NSC, during the Biden administration. And before that, he was director of NIST Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. So just by what I've read, and shared with you. We have a remarkable panel. So what I'd like to do is ask each of you to kind of share your perspective. Say a little bit more of maybe things that I left out in terms of better understanding the lens in which you see things. So let's do this in the order that I introduced you. So Bobbie, I have you as first.
Oh, happy to. Thank you, Alan, and many thanks to NAPA and to my colleagues because I'm sure this is going to be an incredibly important conversation, a really lively one, and really an important one in this moment as well, because uh, I believe I believe that that my colleagues will agree the threat environment isn't getting any better. The technology landscape isn't getting any simpler, and the demands on our state and local colleagues are not getting any lighter. And there's an awful lot of ambiguity in the moment, and it just creates this very uncomfortable situation um, for everyone, and particularly for the folks on the front line. And so you rightfully pointed out a great deal of my experience in the federal landscape, but I've had the privilege of living within the federal government, living and operating in the federal government during moments of digital transformation, serving in academia and working with critical infrastructure owners in academia and working in the private sector, bringing product to market and bringing capability to bear. And within all of those perspectives, it is clear to me that the state and local governments are on the front lines every day in providing citizen services. And I have a special project. I serve on the board of the Center for Internet Security, which is an important part of the community of individuals helping state and local governments be successful in this moment. And so it's a real passion for me to try to make sure that we can put everything we can in the hands of the people who are doing the hardest jobs every day, and being in the balance between providing citizen services and needs of individuals on a daily basis, being at the forefront of national security concerns that they need to understand and be resourced to react to, and transforming themselves all at the same time.
Cool. And we talk about that last role, for those of you who didn't see the connection, that is the parent of MS-ISAC
Mhm.
and the former election ISAC. And when I was the exec director at PTI, and to this day, we are the strongest supporters. I feel that we have been a cheerleader for them for the last decade, and very concerned about the future directions and the problems and challenges that face all of us, in particular them, because they were such a provider of amazing resources. Tracy.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Bobbie, for asking me to come along, and good to see you again, Alan. I've been in and out of state government for about 20 years. I was the CIO for the Department of Revenue for a long time, so very familiar with IRS 1075 federal requirements around the data, as well as other state cybersecurity requirements. As the deputy state CIO and state CIO for North Carolina, obviously, cybersecurity has become more and more important, not just state for state's sake, but what happens in local government and education. So in my role as president and CEO of MCNC, our cybersecurity focus is higher ed, community colleges, and K through 12, where many times we see the first entry point into a state is through those particular organizations because they're seen as weak and vulnerable. So our role at MCNC is really focused on that. As a state CIO, the work that the state did with local governments to assist when threat actors infiltrated their networks and there were ransomware attacks, particularly during COVID, it was a real challenge in working with those folks as well as the federal government. There's obviously a trust factor that happens between federal, state, and local government. But in these moments, like Bobbie's talking about, a lot of that has to fall by the wayside in order to get organizations back up and running. So when I left state government, the commitment that I made to the governor at the time is that I would continue the two priorities that he had, which was broadband and cybersecurity. And that's exactly what I do at MCNC. So you'll hear me speak a lot about education because that is our heavy focus, which obviously involves local governments as well.
Cool. All right, Jeff.
Thanks also to Bobbie for bringing me here. Thanks, Alan, for the opportunity. So I come at this about 20 years in the national security space. I have about 16 doing cyber. And as I agree with everything Bobbie said, I know panels are more fun when people disagree. I'm going to agree with where Bobbie started. This is really a time like we haven't seen before. There's uncertainty in funding. There's uncertainty in policy. There's uncertainty that's driven by partisanship. And when I think back to my two most recent jobs in government, first at the beginning of the Biden administration, working in the White House as we were working with states and locals. So I did really two main things relevant here. One was handling ransomware on the defensive side, and the second was preparation for the expected Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we worked super closely with states. Not always perfectly, but we worked very closely with them, with the private sector. Also, again, not always perfectly, but we saw a lot of evolution there in terms of what private sector could do, what government said it could do. And one of my biggest takeaways from that experience was there were things that I had said when I was in the private sector, I had heard when I was in government that both sides said that they could not do, not that they would not, but they could not do. And then when we were suddenly faced with a very imminent and real threat, both sides were able to do things that previously seemed impossible. That was great. What I worry about now, though, is we're pulling further apart as Bobbie said, the threats are going up, and the list of impossible is getting bigger. Last point I'll make is, I came into government looking at disaster response, disaster preparedness. My first job was working on the investigation after Hurricane Katrina. So we saw what it looks like when government doesn't respond well, both at the state and the federal level. We saw the importance of planning. And as we live with this uncertainty, the shift in policy, the shift in funding, and this pulling away, I worry about how you all on the front line are able to plan against an ever-changing series of requirements and realities. So look forward to discussing it today, and happy to take any questions when we get to that point.
Alan, I would be remiss if I did not mention that I too am on the board of Center for Internet Security with Bobbie as well.
Good. All right. So now you have it. The way we've designed this, there are a number of questions, and our hope is to just have an honest, frank discussion. And then we're going to leave time for questions. So if you do have questions, we ask that you put them in the chat box, but we will, given the size of the group, we will turn the mics on to let you ask questions of the panelists or to share some thoughts that you have from your own perspective based on what you've heard and also perhaps what you know. I think the big thing that I see setting the stage again is we talk about cybersecurity. I think the new term is cyber insecurity. Local governments are really feeling it. And what's interesting, people forget that unlike the federal government, localities and state governments are required by law to have balanced budgets. Now, they can be very clever in how they achieve that, but they don't print money. And so when things are cut, there's a choice. One is, where do we cut? Or are we to raise taxes? And of course, politically, that is something that nobody seems to want to take on. And then you have this dilemma of there is now these gaps that exist. So let me start with I think something that I mentioned, MSISAC is one example, if I can. I mean, here, well, two things. One, we had MSISAC, and we also had the first federal grant program that went to state and local governments specifically. I was excited. I thought it was pretty imperfect, but I was excited because in the past, if you had a program, you would probably be able to make it better down the road. There might be an expectation for further funding, especially when you think that every member of Congress, Senate or House, all have constituents that care very much about cyber and their institutions. And yet, this is one of the things that seems to be cut dramatically and forcing the organization to become self-reliant. Whether that's possible is another issue. So we have MSISAC that is kind of reconstituting based on a shift in funding priorities. And we seem to have no appetite to continue this federal program that filled a real need to help state and local governments. So now we have this growing void. How is this void going to be made up? That's a fairly general question. Any ideas here?
Well, you said how. I think it's could be a conditional question. Will. That's my biggest fear. I still hold out hope that the state and local cyber grant program will come back for the very reasons you talked about. There are a lot of constituents behind it. It's great to have seen it come to fruition. When I was in the Hill in 2009, 10, 11, 12, working cyber, we tried to push a grant program. Bobbie, you probably remember talking about this, and we got a hard pushback within even our own committee on our own side of the aisle saying, no, last thing we need are new grant programs because they never go away once they're created. It would be sad irony if we finally get one and then that's the one that goes away. So I think whether or will it be filled, but I think it's going to have to come from all sides. And I do think ultimately, because we tend to move in these cycles or pendulum swings, whatever you want to call it, the feds will be back when something external, probably negative drives them to be back. But I don't have a good answer for how in the interim we're going to do the same with less.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with your assertion here, Jeff, that and hope that the grant program is renewed. I know that there are initiatives on the Hill really looking towards trying to help that happen. Unclear whether they will be successful. And I think one of the things that I particularly liked about it was that it really recognized that cyber and the kind of digital resilience that's needed wasn't a one and done concept, right? It really took a maturity perspective for organizations that were there. I mean, I think there are lots of ways, lots of lessons that have been learned over the last several years about what worked and what didn't work in various regions and locations. But the idea that you weren't just going to go buy some tech and be better, I think was a really important piece of that. The question, though, about how we fill a gap, whether we fill a gap, what the gap is that needs to be filled, I think speaks to the need for continued conversation and collaboration between the states in regional constructs, between cities within a state and across state lines. So there's a very intergovernmental discussion that needs to happen here, and with federal partners in each of these areas. And while I am not completely comfortable with where the current policy landscape is, I think, at least encouraged by the fact that there's the beginning of a discussion about responsibility and who has which responsibilities in this area. And that's been pretty nebulous over the last 2 decades as it relates to cyber. And so, I'm not a strong optimist on this topic, but there is a little ray of maybe we can have some clearer discussions that are here and enable the kind of innovation that we need at all levels. I worry about a federal government that comes in and says this is how a state needs to operate, because I think that's a little that's a bit of an overreach for our federal partners, particularly in a world where so much of critical infrastructure is operated at the state level.
Understood, but I'll say this from a different perspective. While we are waiting,
Yeah.
right, for all of this to transpire, there's going to be money spent unnecessarily while states and local governments are trying to create or recreate these types of programs. I don't disagree that, regional cyber commands, cropping up that include state and local governments might be the right thing, but the investment that these states are going to make into these types of programs, and Bobbie, you've heard me say this before, if you add all of that up across the nation, we could have all been able to afford to fill that gap that is needed for MSISAC. And so that's the biggest concern I have, is without that type of funding mechanism and a central neutral space, the states will go inward. They'll start to work inward. There won't be as much of the sharing that you see with MSISAC, which is very, very dangerous. I think it's great,
Agreed.
looking at for your own state, but the inability to share across other states is really what makes MSISAC so meaningful. And I think, during this time frame, there's going to be a lot of money spent that could have been invested elsewhere.
Yeah, I completely agree that ambiguity isn't helping us figure out what the right path forward is, and is causing the expenditure of dollars and of energy. I mean, there just isn't enough money, time, political access, and other mechanisms, and we lose credibility as a cybersecurity community in many instances in resourcing conversations and in transformation conversations without that level of clarity. So I am completely aligned there. I do think that one of the challenges that we have to overcome is really understanding how fundamentally different states operate. And I think MSISAC does a really good job of being that translator for the federal enterprise. But one of the things that to criticize my time in government, and I'm sure Jeff, by the time you were at DHS, it was a different story, but we did not understand clearly how states organized, how they functioned, what were the levers of influence, where were the right interjection points in order to have a conversation about how to manage digital risk in their enterprises.
I mean, it definitely is not a problem we solved. And, we had intergovernmental affairs folks at both in the White House and at CISA, but it really was, you have to deal with each state and frankly every municipality.
That's right.
Meet them where they are and not assume similarities from one state to another, even if they bordered each other. And it takes a lot of learning. And the people who, in both of those roles, I can think of who knew that as well as anyone, many of them are gone. So government has lost that expertise. So to Tracy's point about the inefficiencies and the waste we're going to see, even when you have a federal counterpart now, I think at the state and local level, unfortunately, you're going to have to expect to redo some of the education that you thought you did or you did do over the past few years.
Yeah.
I want to apologize. I guess you noticed I disappeared. It's never happened before. Maybe it was a cyber attack against me, but it seems that you carried the conversation. I have to say that when the grant program that we're talking about, the state and local government grant program was talked about. It took a year to write the rules for that. And I was a very strong vocal critic because they weren't talking to local governments. And I think there's this feeling, I think now there's an acknowledgement. I think, Jeff, you've said it very well, that we are different. I am a local government, state government focused individual. But there was this sense we know, what the problems are, and they're got to be similar, just smaller scale. But when I heard people saying, well, when local government said, what should we be doing? They say, well, look at the NIST framework.
Yes.
Yeah.
The NIST framework is a little complicated if you are a county and
Yeah.
you have a staff of 3 individuals or 4. People don't realize that the majority of local governments in the United States have 5 or fewer local government folks dedicated to technology, let alone cyber. It is the ones we hear about that are lucky enough to have a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, but that's rare. Usually it's a CIO or an assistant city manager that has that burden. And so I think local governments really have a dilemma. They're very much on their own. And one of the great things about MSISAC, which is something that we as a group talked about yesterday when we were thinking about shaping the conversation, is the MSISAC is a sharing information organization. How do we share? First of all, how important is it that we share? And how do we make up that gap? I think there are some ways that can be done, including MSISAC has not gone away.
Right.
It just is changing. So
Yeah.
how do we address this issue of, Jeff, you said it well.
All right, Alan, you locked up again.
We can just leave him there.
Yeah,
Which
exactly.
you said
It's
it well,
good.
so I'm like, I'm
Jeff, you
good.
said many things well, so we'll pick up from that. But one of the comments I want to just make sure folks recognize, Alan is right. So the MSISAC, it still exists. It is still very vibrant and capable. That's there. It has an executive committee that functions and still provides not just information sharing services, but other products and services to help state and local governments and other local enterprises provide the security that they need. So everything from intrusion detection to endpoint security to security operations, threat intelligence sharing. There's a whole range of products and services that exist within the MSISAC. And it is in the process of transitioning to a membership funded model and a lot of uncertainty with the federal enterprise at the moment in that space. But we remain committed to providing valuable services to our state and local partners in this moment of ambiguity as we make this transition. I think Alan's question was, what information sharing opportunities or resources exist here, and how can we keep them and continue them as we go forward? And clearly ISACs are important there as well. There are regional ISACs. There is the MSISAC as a state ISAC mechanism. I know that there are state and local organizations that are members of functionally oriented ISAC, like the Research and Education Network ISAC, the Water ISAC, and others. And so, there is a strong information sharing culture and connectivity points. When we weaken one part of it, it hurts them all, though. And so, we really need to think about it as a fabric that exists across the nation. I don't know, Tracy or Jeff, your thoughts.
I don't disagree with any of that. Yes, there are other ISACs that exist. Their business models are very different. So, their disruption is not going to be seen the way this one is, because we're talking about state and local governments and even nonprofits. So my nonprofit also takes advantage of the services from MSISAC. So I'll say this also, is that the timing couldn't be worse. And so coming from a state government, there are budgets, and a lot of times we do those 2 years in advance, and the priorities are already set. So trying to um, re trying to recover from something like that with our state legislature is not an easy thing to do, particularly if they might be out of session during that time. And so for the state of North Carolina, we have not approved a budget yet. And so that's going to be really, really difficult. And the only way for this to work is for state legislatures to start to dedicate cyber funding for the long term.
Right.
These existing grants expire. And so even the state and local cybersecurity grant mechanism is not forever. It is a short-term investment to get you up off the ground, but somebody's still going to have to continue to pay for that into the future. And so there's still a need to look at it specifically from a state and local government perspective as it relates to information sharing. And Bobbie, you or Jeff can speak to this too, is how important it is for the nation to have the sharing across all the states and how it informs national security. So I don't want to get out over my skis on that one. You both know more than I do. I know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be helpful in that realm, but I see that really clearly. So if either one of you want to touch on that a little bit, that is one of my biggest concerns, is the impact on national security when those kinds of structures don't exist.
Yes, the cliche of information sharing being a two-way street, and and it's not a stereotype, the history of the US government being very good, the federal government being good at taking in information and not giving it back out. Largely thought of in the private sector context, but I think it historically was also true with the states and locals. Tracy, what you talked about, what I saw when I was at CISA 2024 was if we had a fairly robust relationship of giving information back and forth, and we would post SolarWinds, the federal government invested a lot of money in the ability to look across federal domains, to take a small breadcrumb of information. And just rewinding for a second, when we did a SolarWinds review, and I was in the White House when we were doing these, we found a couple of things. One was looking back, we saw events that were almost certainly part of the campaign, but we didn't see enough of them, and we couldn't correlate across federal agencies. So combination of Congress, executive agency action, and executive order, we put in place a fairly broad deployment of EDR technology, which was paying off significantly. By the time I left, we were detecting significant sophisticated nation state activity from a very small amount of data, because if we saw event in agency A, we could correlate against agency B, C, and D. We also had an ability to work with, when we pulled data out of the government, state government or the private sector, but to get that information in and to push it back out in alerts. Without question, we need to get better. We can always get better at the speed and the quality alerts we pushed out, but we had come a long way. We are losing capacity at the federal government to do all of that, both to take it in and to push it out. We are losing ability to collect information. And when we devolve cyber responsibility to the states and localities, there's a lot of goodness in that, assuming that either they have or the federal government can provide the resources to do it well. But there are some things that only the federal government can do. Even the biggest states in the nation do not have foreign intelligence collection capability, nor probably should they. And the ability of the federal government to collect that information, distill it out, and increasingly be able to push out either at the classified or increasingly at the unclassified level, actionable information. And that started in the NSA. A guy named Rob Joyce there took it upon himself to say, like, we need to be able to push out the how without the who. And we came so far in that, and I worry about backsliding, both not having the information to put out and losing the muscle memory of how to do that, because those people won't be there. So hopefully I got at your points, Tracy. There's a lot of words there, but this two-way sharing between the states and the feds, if we lose it, we're going to end up with security incidents.
And the national security, the balance of that two-way sharing and national security interests is vital, but it's also vital in that it supports the ability for states to do economic development, right? This digital infrastructure, which is so important for economic development at state and local levels, is really dependent on a level of stability that can be provided by this two-way sharing in part, so that states can more effectively prioritize the limited resources that they have to the most effective places in their specific domains, and through information sharing consortiums and ISACs and others can provide insights, those breadcrumbs back to a central analytic capability, while protecting the privacy and civil liberties of the end citizens as well, which is really an equally important balance to find.
So I'm back with a different computer, a different connection, a different headset. So I want to kind of move the discussion in a slightly different direction. I've sounded very anti-federal. I've had my frustrations, but I've also had my frustrations, no offense, Tracy, with many of the state governments. They had the same problem. I mean, these three players, federal, state, and local, are always lumped together with a comma. And when you look at the distance, you don't realize how big the spread is between the commas in terms of information sharing, getting information out. We did surveys saying how many people have had any relationship or knowledge of their state CIO. And I would say 3/4 had no relationship and would like to have one. And yet when I talk to the state CIOs, they're saying, well, it's just me. And there's so many of them. And so we have lacked models that really help bring us together. And I think, Jeff, you kind of alluded to that. We've really come so close. I think information sharing about a year and a half ago was better than ever, and improving in remarkable ways. So we're dealing with uncertainty, and we know no business can plan well in an uncertain environment. No local government can plan, no state government. So everybody's building contingencies, which is wasteful. Tracy, you're right. Yet, how do we deal with this uncertainty? Because I think that's a given. I mean, I can make an argument that maybe we collectively have failed to make the most important points to the key policymakers of really what's at stake. For local governments, for example, we assume that the federal government is here to protect us against enemies. In terms, that's why we have an army and a navy and all these other weaponries. But now suddenly local governments are asked to fend for themselves. And that's kind of scary because they are being attacked by international actors. They, in many cases, are the weakest link and sometimes a backdoor into the federal ecosystem. So there is a relationship between all of us, more than just commas. What can we do? What are the strategies that we can do if this uncertainty remains for the next 24 months, for example? We're unable to make the case. Congress is unwilling to kind of take a closer look. I can think of better arguments to be made. If AI is such a sacred national goal, which it should be, we need to protect data because that's what feeds AI. I don't think maybe the connection has been made strong enough, not to us, but to the policymakers who have a very limited range of understanding of the policy implications of what we're talking about. What can we do? What is going on that we can say this is a good model? Let me think of Texas, for example. They have developed 20 some odd centers of excellence for cybersecurity to help smaller local governments. This is a beautiful role for the state, and they're coordinating with community colleges, technical colleges, or whoever's the strongest in a given region. Is this a model that other states should be thinking about? Thoughts?
And so I'd say yes to that. And I think, the other component here, particularly for local governments and how they integrate threat intelligence into their daily operations, there needs to be a couple of things, regardless of where it comes from. Providing services and capabilities that allow them to take action and reduce work. So as you mentioned before, you know, even from an education point of view, you can't be the soccer coach and the physics teacher and responsible for cybersecurity and really do that well, right? And adding more tools adds more blinking lights. My VP of cybersecurity talks about this all the time. They don't need more blinking lights. They don't need more a deluge of alerts. What they need is the expertise there to help them determine how to act on those things. And so having, to your point, Alan, universities, community colleges step in, and even research and education networks, which is what MCNC is. It's a research and education network. There are several across the country in many other states. There's few of us that are as strong in cybersecurity as we are, but you know, continuing to build those is really helpful. And then these public-private partnerships will have to strengthen over time in order to assist these local governments, because otherwise we'll just continue to sell them more tools and generate more work, which will divert their attention from things that are really important, and to allow more weaknesses and vulnerability into the cybersecurity network, no pun intended there. I think the Texas model is good. I think there could be other models that, again, involve other players into the mix, like research and education networks, like public-private partnerships. I've spoken with several vendors now that are really interested in helping states figure this out, and knowing that there's not going to be a whole lot of money in it for them, but if we all don't win, they don't either. And so, you know, continuing to put that pressure on them as well is going to be really important, because it will start at local government, it will spread to state government, and then even more so to federal government. So we'll all be affected by what happens at the local government level.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think about this in terms of size, right? Scale is really important. There are 56 states and territories. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has like 574 Indian nations. There are 3,000 counties. There are more than 18,000 local entities, state local entities. This is not, there's one federal government. Now there are more than 100 departments and agencies within it, but there's one U.S. government. And so, I mean, this pyramid is very, very steep for us to really understand and align. And the most successful state and local organizations are supported by people from that locality, from that state, right? It isn't so we've got to deal with this as an industry so that we can also help reinforce getting the talent, keeping the talent at these localities, so that it isn't to your example, the physics teacher, soccer coach, and operates the lights at the soccer field. Right? We've got to keep get the talent back into there. I look at some of the. I think it's Louisiana that has a series of centers that align not just with community colleges, but with high schools as well, with the idea of bringing the kids back into Louisiana and supporting many of those local items. The same thing is going to be necessary in AI. And so this is a cybersecurity conversation about state and local governments. It needs to be that. But your point about the connection to the data, not our future in AI is not about 3 frontier models stored in data centers in 4 places in the country. It's about having it be empowered everywhere, which means we need the protections everywhere, and we need the people in those places in order to execute.
I'm going to go back. I think if I remember your original question out, I'm going to talk about it in a little different way. You know, when I think about first principles for states and locals, it's the basics of keeping the lights on, and I'm going to flip back around on what I said earlier about only the feds can provide the threat intelligence or the foreign collection. But the quality of private sector specific cyber threat feeds is incredible and has evolved, and we are forcing, and that has forced us in CISA, or forced when I was there, to readjust what we did to prioritize quality over volume, because the volume was out there in the private sector. But the other thing is, you don't have to look far to see both government or private sector publications about where the real threats are coming from and what they're targeting in the critical infrastructure sector. So maybe one of the strategies is, like, don't overthink it. Don't assume there is some special sauce or secrets that the government's holding. Go after the obvious, and if you haven't fixed them, then maybe or once you've fixed them, then you can worry about what you're missing. But it's hard for me to think, when I think back to even the classified stuff we were doing, so much of the actionable or knowing what an entity needs to do or an organization should address is out there. And that goes back to what I was talking about before, in the capacity of the government to push out at an unclass or low classification level. So I think there's enough information out there to be able to set a strategy. At the individual tactical level, maybe it could get harder, and that's where it's going to be more state or region specific.
And I guess this is where MSISAC could come in terms of, in its new or refined mission, kind of develop a kind of a new coalition of the willing, and look for these models of support. When I look at the local government example I gave you, where majority of these small entities have less than 5 technical individuals, what I left out is that we're seeing an enormous increase in managed services. So now suddenly, this is part of the vendor community, and they
Right.
have a lot at stake, because collectively they are now providing expertise where the local governments cannot afford to have that. And there was an interesting memo that came out from CISA, FBI, everybody, warning some of these providers that they weren't taking cyber seriously enough. And that was 3 years ago, August. I think there's been a massive improvement with that kind of nudge. But they've got to step up too. There's a lot at stake here, but I think there is this network looking for some leadership to kind of figure out what are the solutions. And every state might have somewhat different kind of solution, but I think at the end, we need to share information. We need to share what is happening quickly so we can avoid it repeating itself somewhere else. We need to, I think, address the skill shortages that are out there, and maybe look at some of the newer kind of solutions, like working with the National Guard in the cyber departments. There are now 12 units that are working to help. I think that's a good use of the National Guard, incidentally, to working with localities to assess where they are, or to help remedy a situation that may have occurred.
Yeah, I mean, I think sharing information is necessary, but I think we also need to think about scale in protection and prevention as well, right? That's one of the other places when I think about the services that organizations like the MSISAC provide. It's a shared prevention capability where you can gain greater scale, because we have two challenges. Tracy rightly points out, they don't need more blinking lights. So the vendor community that's incented to bring forward a tool with 27 cool features, perhaps we need to help them understand, help the state recognize, or the locality recognize, that these 3 features are what they need, and here's how we need to narrow it down so that it most effectively supports your set of services. And when you can do that at scale, you lower the cost for everyone.
You
Yeah.
do. I do think there's some foundational pieces that have to be there too, like prioritize for smaller counties to prioritize their
Yeah.
core practices, like access controls, those types of things. And although outsourcing can be frowned upon in some instances, but some instances it makes sense for them to leverage a SOC that is not within their organization because they can't afford to do that. Those outsourcing of payroll and data hosting and things like that, they really do make sense so that they're focused on what their core mission is. And then, as Jeff mentioned a little bit, is they're establishing their incident response and their disaster recovery models. Those foundational things probably need to happen first before we, on top of that, add these other pieces that might be a little more, take a little more time and a little more expertise. But if they can get those things handled, which many of them can with state and local help, those other vendor partnerships would be more valuable.
Agreed. So we have, I think, the beginnings of a recognition that the uncertainty we're facing at the federal level will continue. We may not like it, but that's, I think, going to continue. And that we recognize the need for not only information sharing, but understanding the ability to scale to set priorities for what is doable in any given jurisdiction, knowing that you can't do it all. Jeff, you said as much even at the federal level. You got to figure out strategically what is it that we can do to make the most sense of the resources that we have. As an aside, when the guidelines first came out for the very first state and local federal grant program for cybersecurity, it was a little complicated. There were like 14 boxes and bubbles that had to be filled out. But the one thing that I heard from so many local governments and a few state governments was, this alone is helping me figure out what my priorities are. And I was shocked to realize that many people just weren't sure what they should be asking for. And so this application forced them to look at what are the essentials. There were, I think, 7 essentials that they basically, to get this grant, had to address. It's like touch these bases and then be able to address some other concerns, but it forced them to do something that I would have thought they would have known, and that is to prioritize, what is it? If I had all this money tomorrow, where would it go? How would it go? Where would I put it? And they were starting from zero. And we warn people a year in advance, start thinking about what would help you the most. So it seems like there's got to be some better guidance to some of these localities. And also some of these service providers that, are dealing with these very small pockets of local governments that also are struggling. So I think we have a national crisis when it comes to protecting our state and local infrastructure. I don't know what other word to describe it other than we're operating on steam when we should go nuclear, and we don't have the resources. Further thoughts, or should we open this up to our wonderful patient audience?
The only thing I would say to that too is the responsibility can't only be on the federal government. State and local governments are going to have to get, I hate this word because it's so overused, but really innovative about how they start to operate without this federal funding. And so if that means creating programs like CISO as a service by utilizing veterans, which is something that North Carolina did a while back, which was very, very valuable. So those CISOs were able to go into local government and state agencies in order to assist. And it was helping those veterans, and it was also meeting the need of those agencies and local governments. That's just a small thing, but innovative, thoughtful workforce development efforts are going to be required. And again, thinking about it, and I said this recently, and I hope it doesn't come out wrong, but relying solely on federal government to solve the problems may not be the right approach. So I said the same thing about broadband. After, the changes around the broadband, the BEAD funding that's coming down the pike and the changes to that have really thrown the states into a tizzy. It's like, well, now we're going to have to figure out a new way of getting the funding that's required in order to provide connectivity, in order to have cybersecurity. And I don't think anyone has really shifted their thinking to what happens if I'm not getting the federal funding. What happens now? And what's that approach rather than waiting until it becomes available? I'll get off my soapbox now.
All right. If the folks at Napa could unmute everybody, I'm open to questions. This is a great opportunity. We've got three fantastic panelists here, and you've all been very, very good listening. But I'd very much like to hear your comment or ask a question of any of our panelists. Anyone?
Looks like there's something in the chat. Sorry.
That was me. That was just me, like adding color, flavor. Hi, Virginia Huth here. I guess I'd say, I think my big takeaway from what you're saying is there's a need to help bring together state and local or even tribal communities, to share information and develop a plan for resilience. So that's the big education side. So does Napa have any plans to support that the development of that sort of a coalition or consortium?
Well, it's something that the Standing Panel on Technology Leadership should consider, and we will be talking about this as well as AI in November. So you raise a very, very good point. I mean, I think that's what we were formed for. The key word here was leadership. We're not interested in the blinking lights. We're interested in the leaders who operate systems, who provide the leadership for the right systems at the right time, making sure people are trained accordingly. But I think this might be an opportunity for Napa to work with MSISAC
Yep.
and all the willing. I mean, I don't want to reinvent the wheel because I think there are other parties out
That's
there.
right.
But we could be part of a coalition and offer our expertise to kind of keep this discussion alive. But more importantly, how do we turn this into action?
Yeah, I mean, I think the partnership with the Center for Internet Security is worth exploring. And I think it needs to be done in alignment with the Standing Panel on Intergovernmental Affairs, because I think there's a very real intersection between the two in a way, in an interesting way. I also think, I mean, if we talk about what are some tangible things that need to be done here, I think that's an important thing, right? We need some kind of cohesive policy around what is our national risk tolerance on key items. That's an important function for us, I think, in a number of topics, and that has to happen. We need to talk about minimum standards for security that we can coalesce around, something like the CIS benchmarks, something like, those are useful industry-driven frameworks for things that I think are helpful. I think we need state and local governments need to understand and publish what kinds of guidelines are necessary in their states around data and data protection. There are some that come from federal and industry areas, PCI, privacy data, and others. But until we have what's important in the state or at the local enterprise, and these aren't technology questions; these are functional questions, and it ties back to Tracy, your comment about what's important.
I would add AI to that list, Bobbie.
Agreed.
Because it is the shiny object that everybody's looking at. And when we link that to data integrity and the risks inherent with that, I think suddenly people go, oh, I didn't make that connection.
Yeah,
and
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And I think that we also need an effective and viable CISA at DHS. I mean, I feel really strongly that there has to be a civilian connection for state and local governments to interact with. And that's, I think, a really important place for that to exist as well.
I would say, and Alan, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, engaging the National Association of State CIOs.
Yeah.
Because they're going to contribute heavily to some of these discussions. And for your point about the Texas model, being able to share those things, not just across the states, but also with local governments. And so having an engagement with the state CIOs and that organization is an easy way to get at some of that information too.
Good suggestion. I work very closely with Doug, and it so happens that Doug is on this panel and is a Napa fellow. So I'm
Hi,
sure
Doug, out there.
I'm sure he would be most interested in supporting that.
And I know the Aspen Digital Group also has has a focus in the state and local area as well. And so, I mean, I think there's a really good coalition that we can bring together to help in this area.
Good. Jeff, any words of encouragement from your view?
Bobbie said something earlier about the importance of there being a civilian component. And I think to the extent the people on the front line at the states and localities, they can make that point better. I will be making that point in writing relatively soon as part of a compendium about CISA. But to me, it is essential that we have an agency that is civilian at the federal level, civilian focused, that is team defense only.
Yeah.
Brings a different perspective to the interagency conversations within the federal government. It brings a different face to the state and localities. It also provides an easier in for a lot of companies, particularly those that work internationally, who may not want to deal with a military or intelligence component. And I worry that we are losing the thread on why CISA was created, but more importantly, why there was a push for a decade before that to create something like that. Because in the cyber realm, it is important that we have a civilian face. Tracy talked about the privacy element of it, another key piece of it. So I don't want to be asking for lobbying or anything like that, but to the extent you all are in support of it, I think it's important for our elected officials to hear that it is important that we have a civilian defense focused face for these efforts.
Excellent point. All right. I see we are a little past the hour. Is there anyone else that from the audience that would like to weigh in with a comment? If not, hopefully we're leaving everybody with a sense that we see what's going on, and we all remain optimistic. Is that a fair thing to say?
We have to.
Hopeful. We have to.
We
Yeah, I
have.
think-
Dramatically optimistic.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, if you missed any part of this session is recorded and it will be put onto the Napa website. And we hope to see you in November at the annual event. And we will definitely keep up with this topic and explore how we might work as part of a coalition. Because I think there are people that are better positioned to be a lead, but I think we should be part of it and see what we can do. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Bobbie, for putting together and bringing Tracy and Jeff to this event. And thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully you found this enlightening, interesting, and I like to say hopeful. So with that, take care.
Thanks all.
Thanks all.